The night the alarms screamed. It was just after midnight. September 26, 1983. The world was asleep, but its fate hung by a single thread. In a secret Soviet command bunker buried beneath the ground, a young officer stared at a glowing screen. Red lights were flashing. Alarms were screaming. His computer was telling him that 5 American nuclear missiles had just been launched, straight toward Russia. His name was Stanislav Petrov. And in that moment, he had to decide, should he report the attack, or wait and risk disobeying orders? The world would not know it yet, but that single decision would mean the difference between life and extinction. The Cold War was at its most dangerous peak. Both superpowers had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the Earth dozens of times over. All it would take was one false alarm, one wrong decision, one frightened human hand, to end everything. But this story isn't about war. It's about one man's impossible courage, when everyone else would have followed the machine. Stanislav Petrov wasn't a general. He wasn't famous. He wasn't powerful. He was just a lieutenant colonel assigned to watch the early warning satellites for signs of an American attack. His duty was simple. If the system detected incoming missiles, he had to immediately report it to his superiors. Within minutes, the Soviet Union would retaliate with hundreds of their own warheads. There would be no time to think, no room for hesitation. But on that night, something inside him refused to believe the screen. He looked again at the flashing words, "Missile launch detected." Then 2 missiles. Then 3. Then 5. The computer's voice repeated the same deadly confirmation, over and over. His subordinates turned to him, terrified. Their faces pale under the cold fluorescent light. They waited for his command. If he followed the protocol, he would report, "Launch detected," and within minutes, the world would be plunged into nuclear war. If he disobeyed, he could be court-martialed, or worse. History tells us that courage often looks like charging into danger. But sometimes, courage looks like doing nothing. Like sitting perfectly still, while the world burns inside your mind. For 23 endless minutes, Stanislav Petrov sat frozen in front of his console. Sweat dripped from his face. Every instinct screamed that the computer could not be wrong, that this was the moment the world had feared for decades. But something didn't make sense. Why only 5 missiles? Why not hundreds? He had studied American strategy. He knew the U.S. would never start a nuclear war with just 5 warheads. It had to be a malfunction. And so, he made a choice that no one else dared to make. He refused to press the button. That silence may have saved humanity, because minutes later, the radar screens cleared. The attack vanished. There were no missiles. No explosions. No war. It had all been a false alarm, sunlight reflecting off clouds, misread by Soviet satellites. But the system didn't know that. Only one man did. On that night, while billions of people slept under peaceful skies, a single man held the world in his hands, and chose restraint over rage. He chose humanity over protocol. He chose to trust his heart over the machine. This is the story of the man who saved the world, and was forgotten. A man who faced the greatest test of moral courage in history, not by fighting, but by pausing, by thinking, by feeling. And to understand why this night mattered, we must go back. Back to the beginning of the Cold War. To the paranoia, the fear, the endless race to prepare for a war no one wanted. Because to understand what Stanislav Petrov did, you must understand the world he lived in. The world didn't end that night. But it almost did. The Cold War machine. The Cold War wasn't fought with bullets, but with shadows, secrets, and fear. 2 superpowers stood on opposite sides of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a silent standoff that could turn deadly in minutes. From the ashes of World War II rose a new kind of war, one fought in laboratories, underground bunkers, and orbiting satellites. The weapons were invisible, until the very last second. Both sides built nuclear arsenals so massive that one launch would trigger the end of civilization. Thousands of missiles, hidden under ice, buried beneath deserts, floating under the sea, all waiting for a signal. A signal, like the one that appeared on Stanislav Petrov's screen that night. By 1983, the Cold War had reached a fever pitch. The US had deployed new nuclear missiles in Europe that could strike Moscow in less than 10 minutes. The Soviets, terrified of a surprise attack, built massive early warning systems, satellites designed to detect American launches instantly. But these systems were new, untested, and unstable. And in the minds of the Soviet leaders, every signal could be the one that started the end. The Soviet Union was drowning in paranoia. The Americans called it deterrence. The Soviets called it mutual destruction. The people called it peace through fear. To keep that peace, both nations built machines designed to act faster than human thought. Satellites that could see missile trails before they reached space. Computers that could decide in seconds whether to retaliate. The logic was brutal. If one side attacked, the other must strike back instantly, before being destroyed. There would be no phone calls, no meetings, no hesitation, just reaction. Inside the Soviet Union, entire cities were built underground for nuclear command. Concrete walls, endless corridors, no sunlight, only screens, codes, and silence. The officers who worked there lived under constant pressure. They knew that one mistake, one misread radar echo, could kill millions. And still, they were ordered to trust the system more than their own hearts. Stanislav Petrov entered this world not as a hero, but as a technician, an engineer who understood how these machines worked. He wasn't chosen for courage or loyalty. He was chosen because he was precise, calm, logical. He was the kind of man who followed orders. But deep down, Petrov had something the system could never program: doubt. And doubt can be the last human defense against madness. In early 1983, relations between the US and the Soviet Union hit their lowest point in decades. President Reagan called the USSR an evil empire. NATO began massive military exercises near Soviet borders. The KGB reported that an American first strike was being planned. Soviet generals were convinced the West was preparing to attack. Their orders were clear: if any sign of a launch appeared, retaliate immediately. The system was designed to make sure no human could stop it. And yet one man did. Petrov's assignment was at a top-secret facility called Serpukhov 15, just outside Moscow. It was here that the Soviet Union watched the sky every second of every day, waiting for the first flash of an American missile. Every officer in that room knew what would happen if the alarm ever sounded. They trained for it. They simulated it. But no one really believed it would come. And then, one quiet night in late September, it did. Just after midnight, the screens flickered. A single word appeared: launch. Then another. Then another. The sirens howled. Red lights exploded across the room. Computer systems screamed warnings that 5 US missiles were heading straight toward Russia. There was no time to think. Only minutes before impact. Every protocol demanded that the officer on duty Petrov report the launch as real. That single report would have triggered the Soviet nuclear response. Thousands of warheads would be launched toward the US, Western Europe, and beyond. Humanity had waited decades for peace, and in one glitch of a computer, it was about to die. And then, everything froze. The officers looked to their commander, the man whose hand would decide the future. Stanislav Petrov stared at the flashing red screen. His instincts told him to follow protocol. His conscience told him something was wrong. He didn't know it yet, but he was staring straight at history's most important mistake. The machine was built to protect the nation. But that night, the machine was ready to end the world. And one man, a single tired officer, would have to stand against it. The man behind the uniform. Before he became the man who saved the world, Stanislav Petrov was just another boy growing up in the Soviet Union. A child born not into power, but into survival. He was born in 1939, in a small village near Vladivostok, the same year World War II began. When bombs fell across Europe, his world was still green, quiet, and cold. But his father, a pilot in the Soviet Air Force, was called to fight. For young Stanislav, war wasn't a word from the news. It was a shadow at the dinner table. A fear in his mother's eyes. He learned early that peace is not permanent, and that the world can end without warning. When the war ended, his country was in ruins. Cities reduced to dust, millions gone. But out of those ashes, a new empire began to rise. The Soviet Union promised strength, progress, order. But behind that promise was something colder: silence. Petrov grew up in a world where questioning authority was dangerous, where loyalty was survival. He studied mathematics, engineering, and eventually joined the Soviet Air Defense Forces. He didn't seek glory. He sought stability. He believed in reason, in systems, in logic, because logic didn't lie. Or so he thought. As a young officer, Petrov worked in a field few understood: early warning systems. He became an expert on satellite detection and radar analysis. He understood how machines saw the world. He was calm, methodical, and rarely emotional. His superiors called him disciplined. His peers called him strange, too quiet, too analytical. But it was that quiet mind that would one day save billions. Stanislav married a woman named Raisa, a kind, sharp-minded nurse. Together they built a small, simple life in a small Soviet apartment. Not rich, not poor, but peaceful. His work was secret. Even his wife didn't know much about it. He rarely talked about stress, about the endless drills, the fear of making a mistake. She once asked him, "What would you do if the war really started?" He smiled and said nothing. He didn't want to imagine it. Petrov was not a man of ideology. He didn't care about communism or capitalism. He cared about people: his wife, his colleagues, his mother who lived far away. But in a system built on obedience, that kind of humanity was dangerous. The system wanted perfect soldiers, not moral thinkers. And Petrov was both. By 1983, Petrov had become a lieutenant colonel in charge of monitoring OKO. The Soviet Union's new early warning satellite network, IT, was considered the crown jewel of Soviet defense, a machine that could detect an American nuclear launch within seconds. But Petrov knew how fragile it was. He had seen data anomalies, false readings, technical glitches that could mean the difference between peace and annihilation. He trusted his instincts more than the machines, and that made him unique. He often said, "Computers are fast, but they don't feel. They don't know fear, they don't know mercy." It wasn't a statement against technology. It was a statement for humanity. The human heart, he believed, must always have the final say. On September 25, 1983, he returned home from work exhausted. His wife, as always, had waited up for him. She had made tea. They spoke quietly about the next day. He told her he'd be on the night shift again, a routine watch, nothing special. She reminded him to rest. He promised he would. It was a small, ordinary moment, the kind that fills every human life. Neither of them could know that within 24 hours, that ordinary night would become the most important in human history. That evening, as Petrov drove to the bunker, the city above was quiet. Streetlights glowed in the mist. The Soviet flag hung still in the dark air. To him, it was another shift, another long night surrounded by machines and silence. But to history, it was the night before the end. When he arrived at Serpukhov, 15, everything looked normal: the concrete walls, the metal corridors, the endless hum of electronics. The control room was lit by cold blue light. Rows of officers, each at their station. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust. Petrov sat down at his console, coffee in hand, eyes tired but sharp. On the screens above him, the world glowed in infrared. The system watched America. The satellites scanned every launch site. It was quiet. Too quiet. Petrov logged into the system, checked the instruments, and made his routine entries. Outside, the night was silent. Not a sound, not a storm. Everything seemed peaceful. And yet, beneath that peace, the world's fate waited in the wires, ready to be decided by one false signal. He didn't know it yet, but the next few hours would test everything he believed: his training, his logic, and his humanity. Some men fight wars on battlefields. Some fight them in their minds. That night, one man would fight both. When the sky caught fire. September 26, 1983. 0:15 hours. The control room at Serpukhov, 15 was calm, the kind of calm that exists before a storm. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at his console, filling out routine paperwork. Around him, rows of technicians monitored radar screens that showed nothing but static stars. It was another ordinary shift, one of hundreds. And yet, somewhere, high above Earth, a satellite's sensors were about to betray him. A shrill alarm cut through the silence. Red lights flashed. The massive screen above his head filled with a single, blinding word. Launch detected. The room froze. Every man turned toward Petrov. His coffee cup fell to the floor, forgotten. The computer's synthesized voice repeated it again and again. Missile launch detected. Missile launch detected. On the display, a small red line appeared, rising from the center of the United States, streaking toward the Soviet Union. Then, a second missile. Then a third. Then 5. 5 intercontinental nuclear warheads, enough to kill tens of millions in minutes. The protocol was clear: report to the High Command immediately. If confirmed, the Soviet Union would launch a full-scale counterattack. The world would end before the sun rose. Petrov's hands hovered above the phone. His body trembled, but his mind raced faster than fear. He knew how the system worked. The satellite OCO was designed to detect the heat of missile launches from the U.S. It was supposed to be foolproof. But no system is perfect. And something about this didn't feel right. He pulled up the raw data. The system showed clear readings: 5 missiles, 5 heat signatures, rising from American silos. The machines were certain. But Petrov wasn't. He had been trained to think critically, to look for patterns. And one pattern stood out. This was too small, too limited. Why only 5 missiles? Why not hundreds, like every simulation predicted? If America was going to start a nuclear war, it wouldn't begin with 5. It didn't make sense. The officers in the room were terrified. Some urged him to follow procedure, to make the call. Others just stared at him, pale and silent. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The responsibility of billions rested on one man who hadn't slept properly in days. For a moment, he thought of his wife. Her quiet smile. The warmth of her hand. He imagined the flash of light that could erase her in seconds. He imagined cities burning, children crying, skies turning to fire. And all of it, because of him. If he made the wrong call, whether by action or hesitation, it would all end. I had all the data in front of me, he would later say. But I did not trust the computer. A human must decide, not a machine. He hesitated. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The alarm still screamed. His subordinates waited, frozen. Then, he took a breath. And did something no one expected. He declared the alert, a false alarm. The room fell silent. Time itself seemed to stop. Everyone looked at him in disbelief. He had just violated direct protocol. If he was wrong, nuclear fire would rain down in minutes. But his gut, that quiet human instinct, told him he was right. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. No impact. No detonations. The world was still there. But the computer didn't stop. New readings appeared. The system detected another missile. Then another. A second wave. The pressure returned like a tidal wave. This time, even Petrov's confidence wavered. The data was overwhelming. Multiple launches, all consistent. His mind screamed to obey protocol. His duty said, report it. His instinct said, wait. He stared at the red blinking letters. Missile launch confirmed. And once again, he refused to press the button. It felt like an eternity. Then, the radar screens cleared. No missiles. No explosions. Just silence. The satellite had been wrong. Later, investigators would discover that sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over North Dakota had fooled the sensors into thinking missiles had been launched. A technical glitch. A trick of light. A reflection that nearly ended humanity. But the machine didn't see the difference. Only one man did. And while the world slept peacefully in ignorance, he carried the entire burden of its survival on his shoulders. When the shift ended, and the sun began to rise outside the bunker, Petrov simply removed his headset, filled out his report, and went home. No medals. No applause. Just exhaustion. He had done nothing, and in doing nothing, he had saved everyone. The sky had caught fire, and one man chose not to believe it. That choice, became humanity's miracle. The weight of silence. When Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov stepped out of the bunker that morning, the world was still standing. No mushroom clouds. No blinding fire. No final siren. Just the faint pink light of sunrise spilling across the horizon. He stood there for a long time, breathing the cold air, wondering if anyone at all, would ever know what had almost happened. He went home quietly. No fanfare. No handshake. No word of gratitude. His wife met him at the door. She smiled, unaware of how close the world had come to ending while she slept. Petrov said nothing. How could he? The incident was classified, buried under the weight of military secrecy. He simply sat at the kitchen table, stared at his hands, and listened to the ticking of the clock. Hours ago, those same hands had held the fate of billions. And now they trembled as he lifted a cup of tea. His body was calm, but his mind replayed every second. The alarms. The red lights. The silence. What if he had been wrong? What if the missiles had been real? The questions circled like ghosts. A few days later, Petrov was summoned for questioning. The investigation wasn't about celebration, it was about blame. Why had he disobeyed protocol? Why had he trusted his instincts over the machine? He told them the truth. I didn't trust the computer. I trusted reason. But reason wasn't in the manual. The officers wrote their reports. They nodded, they frowned, they moved on. Petrov wasn't praised. He wasn't promoted. In the quiet language of the system, he was uncomfortable, a man who thought for himself. And in those days, that was dangerous. His superiors decided not to reward him. They couldn't admit that their billion-ruble warning system had failed. They simply filed it away. Buried it under classified ink. 4 years, no one outside that bunker knew that the world had been seconds from nuclear war. And Petrov carried that silence like a scar. Months turned to years. His wife fell ill. He left the military to care for her. She died not long after. He would later say that night had changed something inside him. He had seen how fragile everything was, how quickly it could vanish. He stopped celebrating birthdays. He stopped watching the news. He lived quietly, in a small apartment outside Moscow, surrounded by fading photographs and silence. And yet, sometimes, late at night, he would dream of that bunker. Of red lights and the word "launch" detected, burning across the screen. He would wake up sweating, heart racing, remembering the night he had held the world in his hands. 2 decades passed before the truth surfaced. A Western journalist found the declassified documents and tracked Petrov down. The world finally learned what he had done, or rather, what he had refused to do. Suddenly, headlines called him the man who saved the world. But Petrov didn't see it that way. I was just doing my job. I'm not a hero. I was just the right person at the right time. He received international honors, a few medals, applause from foreign governments. But back home, little changed. His pension was small. His apartment still cold in winter. The man who saved the world lived in silence. He once said, "We are all so fragile. The whole planet. One mistake, and it's gone." Maybe that's what haunted him, not that he stopped a war, but that it almost happened at all. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017. Quietly. Alone. In his apartment. For months, no one even knew he was gone. The man who had saved humanity, gone unnoticed, just as he had lived. His story is more than a moment in history. It's a mirror, showing us that sometimes the greatest act of courage is restraint. To question the machine when everyone else obeys it. To choose humanity over protocol. And to stay silent, not because you are weak, but because you have already saved enough. The world is still here, because one man said, "No." The lesson he left behind. The story of Stanislav Petrov doesn't end in the bunker. It doesn't end in Moscow, or in silence, or even in death. It lives on, every single day that the sun rises over a world still breathing. We live in an age that moves faster than ever. Satellites circle the skies, algorithms decide our choices, machines predict our fears. And yet, Petrov's story whispers through it all, a quiet warning from another time. It says, don't give everything to the machine. Because even the smartest system can make a deadly mistake. Because sometimes the data lies, but the heart still knows the truth. When Petrov refused to press the button that night, he wasn't rejecting technology. He was protecting what technology can never replace: human judgment, empathy, doubt. He understood something his superiors did not: that logic without conscience is chaos in disguise. That a machine can calculate destruction, but only a human can choose mercy. His decision wasn't made in an instant of bravery. It was built over years of thought, of watching, of listening to the world quietly enough to hear its heartbeat. It was built on humanity. And that's what makes his story eternal. Tick, that's the sound of time, the same sound Petrov heard that night as the world held its breath. And here we are, decades later, still ticking. Still alive. Because one man chose to wait, to think, to not obey the machine. We talk about heroes who fight wars, men who storm battlefields, who raise flags over ruins. But Petrov's war was different. His battlefield was silence. His weapon, doubt. His victory, invisible. He didn't destroy anything. He simply refused to destroy everything. He never saw himself as a savior. He lived and died quietly, without knowing that millions of children, families, and futures existed because of him. Maybe that's what true heroism looks like. Not the need for recognition, but the courage to do what's right when no one is watching. The night Petrov saved the world, he faced a screen that said, "Missile launch detected." Today we face different screens, but the challenge is the same. Do we trust everything we see? Do we react before we think? Do we let fear control the human heart? Petrov's choice is still a question we all must answer. When you look at his story, remember, one person's calm can stop the world from burning. One person's reason can silence the drums of war. One person's choice can save everyone. That's not just history. That's a reminder. Somewhere tonight, another person will face another screen. Perhaps a pilot, a programmer, a soldier, a leader. And maybe they'll remember, somewhere in history, one man once waited, just long enough to give the world one more sunrise. Stanislav Petrov didn't change the world with power. He changed it with restraint. He didn't win a war. He gave us the chance to avoid one. And that may be the greatest victory humanity has ever known. Remember his name. Stanislav Petrov, the man who saved the world. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is nothing at all.